Good afternoon. Today's lesson is about the active and passive voice. This is part 1, and I'm Mrs. Swart, and I'll be taking you through this lesson because the first thing we need to know before we can do this is what the rules tell us. Active and passive are really two methods of writing the same thing, because when you've written it in active or in passive voice, it must still mean the same. And there's a general rule that a sentence may only be used, written in the passive voice, if it contains a transitive verb. And what is a transitive verb? It's a verb that takes a direct object. Now, when you heard about transitive verbs, most of you thought, oh my word, I've no idea what that is. Oops, what is that? And if we look at the sentence, we see that this subject takes a direct object. The subject, I, then the verb is wrote, a letter. A letter is a direct object. And let's look at the whole sentence. It says, I wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper. And you'll see in blue, we have the indirect object. Now, if the sentence was written without the direct object, then we would just have the intransitive verb. There's no direct object. Then what happens is, I wrote to the editor of the newspaper. It can't be written in passive voice. There's no way you can do that in passive voice. So that means that you are going to have a bit of a challenge with that one. It will not be in passive. You can only do the first sentence, I wrote a letter to the editor of the newspaper. That you can do in the passive voice. Is it or isn't it? Yeah, you're asking yourself whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. And if you're not sure, there's a very easy way of finding out whether it is. Rephrase the sentence in the passive voice. Make the object of the action the subject. So what you're really doing is you're swapping your subject and object around. And you'll see we're going to do a type of a formula for that. Now, only the transitive verbs can take direct objects. So if you can rewrite it in passive voice, it's unquestionably a transitive verb. To be able to write these sentences, you need to identify subject, verb, and object. I is the subject, wrote is the verb, and a letter is your object. Now what will happen is you will be able to swap your subject and object around because here we have a transitive verb. If the subject in the active voice is a pronoun, that is I, he, she, it, we, they, you, then it is not necessary to mention it in the passive voice. So you won't have to say by whom it was done because it isn't necessary. You'll see, maybe if you see a memo, you'll see that in a passive sentence, the end, if it's by and then it's something like a pronoun, it'll be written in brackets to show the marker that you can give a mark whether it's written or whether it hasn't been written. Active and passive voice. The active voice, what do we know there? The subject does the action. I wrote a letter. In the passive voice, the object becomes the subject. But instead of saying just subject, verb, object, there are going to be a few changes there because the object becomes the subject, they swap, and is then having the action done to it. I wrote a letter, you would then say a letter was written by me. And here you can see by me is written in brackets to indicate it isn't necessary to write it because it was a pronoun in the first sentence. This is a formula I'd like you to study. Subject, verb, and object. What happens from active to passive? The two swap places. And then you will see there are a few extra words that are added here. It's actually quite interesting how this works. You will see that I have a plus there that says plus, and then in brackets to be, plus the verb, plus by, plus. So we're starting with the subject and object that have swapped. We're starting then with the object in the subject's place, plus the correct form of the verb to be, plus the correct form of the verb, plus by, and then the object. So remember this so that you can always get it right. The verb to be, here we show you that again. And please remember that you must be able to identify the pronoun, because the pronoun will help you to know what is going on. And the verb that is used by this in the sentence is going to identify whether this is past or present. So let's look at this example. Know the formula. We have subject, verb, and object. Okay, now let us see what we can do here. Okay, there's our subject, the man. Pats, that's the verb, and it's in the present tense. The dog, the object. And if we were to replace this with pronouns, we would say he pats it. Now we take the object and we put it at the beginning here. And we start with the dog. Now, because it's a dog and it's it would say it is, because this is present tense. So the dog is, and then you can't just say pats. It's the correct present tense form. The dog is patted by the man. So when you look at this, you'll notice something quite interesting, and that is the following. At the end of the sentence, when you've written active versus passive, you're going to have two more words in your sentence. And this is just in the very straightforward, simple sentences. So you're going to find you have two more words in your passive sentence than in your active sentence. Because what have we added here? We've added the form of the verb to be and by, and that has given us extra words. So remember that when you work with it. The tense and the tense of the verb in the active voice, it's present tense. What does it do? It will determine the tense of the verb to be. So this is pats, it's present, so it says is. If it was patted, it would be was. So remember that this tense that's used here will be the main determiner of the verb to be, as well as the correct form of the verb that is used. Make sure that you know these rules. We're going to carry on with our next lesson, and then we will have a look at a little bit more detail on how to change these sentences. In the meantime, I always tell you practice makes perfect. Go and make sure that you do the quiz to the best of your ability. Use the notes that you have. Here is the link to the quiz. Good luck with the quiz, and there's also the QR code which you can use on the next slide. And I wish you great success with the quiz. Good luck and keep safe. Thank you.